Hi guys, James at RampantLionReviews again for you today with another beer review. For this one we are going to head over to Hannover in Germany, and we're going to visit a brewery who I've done one review from already. So that is going to be Privatbrauerei Herrenhäusen, and we're going to have a taste of their Weizen beer, and it's a Naturtrüb Weizen. So I have to dedicate this beer review to my old colleague Jonathan Blow, who supplied this beer to me. He brought Herrenhäuser Pils and the Herrenhäuser Weizen for me back to Aberdeen from one of his trips home. So a big thank you to Jonathan for supplying the beer for this review. I reviewed the Pils quite some time ago, so it's actually cool to get round to finally reviewing the Weizen as well. And one thing I also want to say with this review before I do it, I always get comments from my German viewers about the type of glass that I use for a Weizen reviews, and I've looked this up. It actually makes no difference to the flavour of the beer whether you use a Weizen glass or whether you use a Stein mug like this. The Weizen glass is designed so that it gives you a bigger head, which apparently is a kind of, they say it's a critical feature of the Weizen, but it makes no difference to the actual flavour of the beer, and I have looked that up, so hopefully that clears up the issue with using different glasses and things. I like using this glass, it makes no difference to the flavour, so I'm going to stick to using this one. But anyway, as is usual with my beer reviews, I'll take you through a very brief history of the brewery. If you want to go straight to the tasting, just fast forward a minute or two into the videos and you will get right there. The brewery website's in the description for you below, along with a link to the other reviews that I've done from Herrenhäuser in the past, and hopefully I can do some more in the near future as well. So anyway, in 1868 the parent company of the brewery, Brauerei Wölfe und Wedekind Herrenhäusen, was established as a general partnership in Hannover. Now the brewery changed their name to Brauerei Herrenhäusen F. Wölfe in 1878, but the brewery was then reorganised and named Aktiengesellschaft Vereinsbrauerei Herrenhäusen in 1880, but the brewery produced their first beer in 1884 and constructed a large steam-powered brewery and their Ausshanks, their sort of brew pubs, in the year 1886. Now 1871 had seen the establishment of the Hanoverian Aktienbrauerei, which would merge with the Hausen Brauerei in 1906, and in 1908 the company, the whole new company that was merged, was accepted into the Association of German Breweries. But by 1913 their brewing output was exceeding 120,000 hectolitres, and then in 1917 the company was part of a three-membered consortium in buying the German brewery in Hanover and also the one-fifth of the share in the Civil Brewery of Hanover, both of which actually closed after they joined this the big kind of federation of companies. But the brewery had been in a legal dispute over their use of the title Mansion Pilsner for one of their beers, but they finally won their case at the Imperial Court of 1930 and they were allowed to use the title of Mansion's beer. But a few years later, in 1934, they introduced diesel power to their brewery as well. A lot of the German breweries in their history like to talk about when they bought railway cars and how the brewery was powered and things like that. But in 1939 a war levy was imposed on the brewery, and then after the war in 1945 different beers were actually brewed for the occupying Commonwealth soldiers. In the north of Germany, of course, that was the British and Canadian occupation zone after the war ended. But over the following years the brewery began to re-equip and construct new facilities, and they also did further renovations and re-equipping of the brewery in the 1970s, so a big period of expansion over the 50s, 60s and 70s for the brewery. And they closed their brewery restaurant in the 1980s, but they continued to expand their range of beers, and they also updated their kegging system as well. And these guys actually had the fastest bottling system in Germany for a period too, so quite an interesting bit of innovation going on at this brewery. But the most important thing after the 1980s that happened in the brewery history was in 2010 when the brewery ownership changed. However, all employees remained at the brewery and the operations were pretty much uninterrupted. But at this point, when the brewery changed ownership, it was renamed Privatbrauerei Herrenhäuser, which is the name that it still bears to this day. And recently, the most recent developments that have gone on at the brewery are kind of green developments and green policies, and this is a huge thing in Germany. They like to power their breweries by solar power and wind power and basically a lot of renewable energy. They like to make their buildings and things very, very efficient in Germany, and that's what a lot of these breweries are actually doing, particularly the big breweries, but a lot of the smaller breweries are doing things like that as well, which is very, very cool. Germany generally is a very environmentally conscious country, which that's something I found when I've travelled there, and it is actually very cool, and the breweries are no exception to that, so it's something that's kind of ingrained in German culture these days. But anyway, that's your kind of brief history of the brewery. To list the other beers you can get from these guys, they have the Premium Pilsner, which is the one I've reviewed for you before. You get the Ice beers, Spezial, this guy here, the Weizen, Hannover Stolz Export, and also an Alster beer as well. So keep an eye out for those. The Pils is a really nice beer from what I remember, so we'll see what the Weizen's like as well. So anyway, I'll bring up the camera and you can have a little look at the artwork on this one quickly. This guy is a 5.5% Naturtrub Hefeweizen. I tried to look up what the specs on the beer were otherwise, but there's not much available on it. This is one of the, I believe this is one of the symbols of Hanover, the sort of horse here. I might be wrong about that, but I'm sure Jonathan told me it is one of the city symbols of Hanover, and that's why they have it. But these beers are kind of affectionately known as Heli by the local population in Hanover. I had a few Hanoverians actually comment on my last video, so as you can see there's a few little badges on the side here, but I think this is one of the city symbols of Hanover. It might be the district symbol from where the beer is actually from. I'm not quite sure about that, but this is meant to be one of the bigger and well-known breweries in Hanover. But without further ado, let's actually get this guy open and we'll get on with the tasting. So as you can see, a nice smoky opening. You can really smell the yeast off that, the kind of yeast and wheat as you open it up. So as you can see, the Stein mug, as I mentioned at the start of the video, it's making no difference to the head. You're still getting a huge head off of this beer, as you tend to do with a Weizen beer. But that'll be enough to pour just now. We can take a little quick look at the colour and just let that settle a little bit. But even without paying too much attention to the aroma on this beer, you can really pick up the wheat and yeast off this guy. So I'll just bring up the light and let you see the colour of this guy. It's a very bright, hazy, sort of orangey golden colour, very nice looking beer. As you can see, there's a kind of massive 3-finger white head on that. Looks very nice. The carbonation, there's quite a few big bubbles just going up towards the bottom of the head, but a lot of little bubbles kind of sticking to the outside of the glass as well. Looks very nice beer actually. If I put my fingers behind it, as you can see, not transparent at all, but absolutely beautiful colour. That's a kind of good way to actually, a good position that you can see it. The light's hitting it just nicely, but absolutely beautiful looking beer. We'll just get the last of it poured and then we'll check out the aroma of this guy. You can see a bit of the sediment kind of coming out of the bottle now. There is a little bit of sediment. You always get that with Weizen beers actually. And I think this guy, I've had this bottle for about a year or so, so you will get a bit more sediment out of this than you would normally. So as you can see, beautiful looking beer. In terms of the aroma, just got a little bit on my nose there. But as you can tell by the aroma, it's got all the typical elements you would expect of a Hefeweizen beer. If you sugar it up a little bit, you get a little bit more of the kind of sweetness of the yeast coming out. So you've got a big kind of white bread base on this guy with some kind of sweet yeast. You're getting the typical kind of wheaty spice as well actually. A nice kind of spicy characters coming out of this guy. I'm just playing with the light in this video. The light's kind of being a bit troublesome when I'm filming this one. And you can see the head's just going down on the beer as well. But it's got all the typical elements that you expect of the aroma here. You've got a nice kind of grassy and citrusy hop coming out at the end. It's quite a sharp citrus on this one actually, but it's mainly, the main component of the aroma is definitely the nice big wheaty, yeasty element to the beer. It smells absolutely beautiful actually, very nicely done. There is just a little bit of peppery spice in here too. There's something just unusual about the yeasty aromas in this beer. But it's a nice peppery spice that's in this one. You've got the nice grassy and citrusy hop that you expect actually. You've got a nice little bit of just kind of banana in here as well, and the sort of spicy, slightly aromatic-y kind of clove leaves as well. But it's got all the aroma elements that you expect of this beer. So without further ado, let's get on and taste it. This is the Privatbrauerei Herrenhäuser Weizen Naturtrub beer. So a toast to my good friend Jonathan Blow. Cheers. It's actually quite a nice light Weizen beer. It's kind of full of flavour, but the first thing that strikes me about this beer is how light and how drinkable it is. So it's quite nice actually. It's nowhere near as kind of thick as some of the ones that you'll get from the very small breweries actually. One thing you always tend to get from the big breweries I find in Germany is that the Weizen beers tend to be a bit lighter. The sort of very small brewed ones tend to be very filling, and you can only usually drink about one glass of these. But this guy seems a little bit more sessionable than that actually. But much like the aroma with this guy, you've got a nice bready yeast malt base that just blankets the tongue there. A very It's not a particularly sweet malt base, it's more of a bready malt base actually, but it's kind of has a little bit of a chalky mouthfeel to it, so very nice yeast malt base in there that's just quite nice. And as I say, it's a bit lighter, so it's a bit more easy drinking than some of the Weizens you'll come across. But you've got a very smooth wheat flavour in there, as you would expect. There's a little bit of banana in there that just kind of moves out towards the edge of the tongue, a definite nice kind of banana and clove element to the flavour there. It's a little bit spicy as well. There is just a little bit of peppery spice just around the edges of the tongue, but at the edges of the tongue you're mainly getting the kind of citrusy hop and the grassy element coming out of it as well. The citrusy element to it is quite juicy. It's definitely a lemon citrus, but there's a good grassy hop presence in there as well, I think. But it's a very kind of it's very light in terms of the yeast in it. It's, as I say, it's got quite a light mouthfeel, this one, and it's really quite drinkable actually. So yeah, I'd stick with that. As you move into the aftertaste of this one, you just get a nice kind of oily bubble that moves towards the front of the tongue, and you get some quite sharp, citrusy, lemony flavours out of there. But there's a good grassy presence as well. You've got this just dry kind of grassy and citrusy hop presence right around the edge of the tongue, but you've got a nice blanket of yeasty flavour, white bready yeasty flavour over the middle of the tongue there. And a nice bit of kind of banana flavour just around the edges of that, but there's a nice kind of peppery spice to this as well, but it is quite mild. As the malt base on this one is nowhere near as filling as some of the Weizens that you will find. It's got a really nice flavour. It's a nice sessionable Weizen is probably the best way to describe this beer. But in terms of the mouthfeel of this guy, I would say it's quite light bodied. It's not even really pushing the mid-bodied section, if you like. It's definitely a light-bodied Weizen, but it does have a good bit of flavour to it. You've got a kind of quite prickly carbonation in there. It's quite highly carbonated actually, but not as highly carbonated as you can get, if that makes sense. So maybe a moderate carbonation is a good way to describe this beer. But you've got a nice wet mouthfeel. You've got a good dryness as well on the edges of the tongue from the hoppy character there, and it does have a slightly oily, but at the same time slightly chalky mouthfeel, which is where you're getting all the nice wheat flavours. So overall, it's actually quite a nice sessionable Weizen beer. It's probably not as full in flavour as some of the ones you will get, as I say, from the very small breweries, the kind of brew houses and things like that, the Brauereis. But you will actually find that this is a very, very sessionable Weizen beer. So if you're after a Hefeweizen that is something that you can quite lightly drink with a nice pizza or something like that, I would say this is definitely one you want to go for. So yeah, no, it's been interesting to review another beer from Privatbrauerei Herrenhäuser. One of the things I should point out with Weizens as well is that I found when I went to Germany, I actually went off them a little bit just because of how heavy they were, but that was because I was drinking Brauhaus Hefeweizen rather than the sort of mass-produced Hefeweizen. So these guys are a little bit lighter, so if you actually go in just to drink Hefeweizen properly, you actually need to prepare your stomach a little bit. But this guy is a nice light beer that you can drink a few of. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this beer review. It's been cool to revisit Hannover and go and do another Herrenhäuser brewery. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this beer review. Let me know in the comments section your own thoughts on this beer below. A really nice sessionable Hefeweizen, which is definitely worth checking out. But please like, subscribe, share, all the usual YouTube stuff, and I hope you've enjoyed this German beer review. I do have quite a few more German ones to do for you in the near future, so stay tuned for that. Cheers!